Something died at his feet, or was dying. Dry river wash, Arizona territory. In the late winter of 1882, the ground was as dry as ashes. The cold wind was bone-chilling, carrying with it the smell of sage and rotting dust from the dead giant trees that littered the dry stream bed. Silas Glay did not want to be here. He did not hunt or patrol or seek peace in nature. His 3 young cows had escaped through a fence that had collapsed last night, a post broken in 2 by swelling frozen ground. His tracks had led him to this place, Dry River Wash, where people said the devil slept in the sand and the Apache burned traders alive. He expected to find only bones, perhaps a few vultures, or the scratch marks of a prairie dog. Instead, what he found was a person, not a traveler, not a white man, but a girl lying silently under the dry roots of a faded cottonwood tree. Her body seemed to be blown to pieces by the wind. Tangled hair, bare skin, blood-black ash smeared across her shoulders, neck, chest, and face. Silas tightened his grip on the reins as the mare reared. Panting and shaking, he stared, eyes narrowed as if waiting for an arrow to cut through the air. Then, slowly, he dismounted, his boots hitting the dry, cracked earth, a harsh thud breaking the silence. The Winchester was across his shoulder, but he did not draw it. There was no need. The girl did not move. She carried no weapons. Only a small deerskin the size of a hand was tied around her waist. Her upper body almost naked, showing bruises, tears, and blue veins standing out against her sun-dried skin. The ash was not applied by accident. He had seen it done before in war. When tribes were punished for treason, it was a mark of humiliation, a mark of banishment, a mark of a life-or-death sentence pronounced by one's own flesh and blood. She was still breathing, shallow and wheezy, but alive. The fever swirled around her like a smoldering fire in a pit of cold coals. Silas knelt, a step away, his hands untouched. The wind whistled through the broken branches, and a crow cawed somewhere on the distant hills. The air was as taut as a bowstring, so thin that any movement could send everything tumbling down. "You shouldn't be here alone," he muttered. Not to her, but as if to confirm that he wasn't crazy to try to help her. He took off his jacket, then the flannel underneath. His skin prickled from the cold wind. But he didn't hesitate. He was tall, his shadow covering her small body as if shielding her from the world. He draped the jacket over her shoulders, each movement slow as if he were stroking a dying wild animal. The girl whimpered softly, a weak sound escaping her parched throat. Her eyes opened briefly, meeting his. There was no fear, nor trust, just acceptance, as if, finally, someone saw that she was still human. Silas lifted her. She was lighter than a sack of straw. Her arms hung limply, her legs swaying lifelessly, the heat of her body not from the sun, but from the fever burning within. He turned toward the wagon. No one had seen him. His farm was 3 miles away, with no roof in the way, only heaven, earth, and man have ever dug a grave for his wife with bare hands. He laid her in the back of the cart, on an old blanket used for sick horses. Her eyes were still closed, but her breathing was still there, and that was enough. The cart began to roll, the tires screeching across the hard ground, echoing like a trumpet call of an impending battle. The wind had changed. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she was left behind, but he knew one thing for sure. If he left her behind, there would be another body lying quietly under that cottonwood tree tonight. And he didn't have enough room in his heart to dig another grave. As the carriage rolled into the clearing near his cabin, Silas slowed the horse and stopped right in front of the stable. He climbed down, not in a hurry, moving with the weary precision of a man used to doing everything alone. He opened the door to the cabin first. It was small inside. One room, a stone fireplace, a plank floor, and against the farthest wall was a table and 2 chairs. Though only one was in use, inside was clean, practical, and cold as ice. He lit an oil lamp, then fanned the flames with a few dry logs. It didn't take long to warm up. He had to be efficient here. He turned back to bring her in. As he lifted her out of the carriage, She made a sound, a small groan of pain, but did not wake. Her head rested on his chest. He carried her straight inside and placed her on the bed. The mattress was thin, but the blanket was thick. He carefully covered her with the blanket, avoiding contact with her skin if possible. She was running a high fever. He took water from the barrel outside, poured it into a tin basin, and dipped a clean cloth in it. When he sat next to her and touched the cloth to her forehead, her body flinched. Reflex, a muscle memory of fear, he pulled his hand back. "You're safe here," he muttered. Not to tell her, to let him hear himself say it. He cooled her skin as best he could, let her rest. He didn't undress her, no need. The few clothes she wore were torn, and she was covered now. But he saw bruises. The ashes were smeared on her chest, her ribs. Someone did this to humble her, to humiliate her, not just to exile her. He did not know why her tribe had abandoned her. Perhaps she had refused a marriage. Perhaps she had disobeyed some elder. He did not care, not now. She was still breathing. That was what mattered. Then he put a pot of beans on to boil and hung the coffee over the fire. As night fell, the lights in the cabin dimmed, and the world outside became dark and silent. He sat at the table, staring into the fire, his back hunched, a tin cup in his arms. He could not sleep in bed, not now. Not while she lay there, half-conscious, feverish. So he took a woolen blanket from the shelf and spread it on the floor near the fireplace. He took off his boots, rolled his coat into a pillow, and stretched out fully clothed. But he did not close his eyes. Every time she stirred or coughed, he listened. Every time the wind scratched the wall, he sat up and looked out the door. At one point, near midnight, she cried out. A sharp, hoarse sound that seemed to tear from her stomach. She was dreaming. Her hands twitched under the covers. She turned her face to the wall. He did not wake her. He just sat by the fire and watched. He remembered that sound. He let it out once, 17 years ago in Virginia, when the cannonade stopped and the smoke cleared, and he realized half his company wasn't breathing. The kind of noise that doesn't come from the throat. It comes from deeper. By dawn, the fever had not broken, but she was still alive. He fed the horses, cleared the manure, and brought more wood to the fire. Then he turned and placed a tin cup full of water near her hand. The bread, too, a small piece wrapped in cloth. He made no attempt to talk to her, did not ask her name. He didn't ask if she understood him. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Anyway, it didn't matter. He just let her rest. Hours passed. Around noon, he returned from the stables. The fire was burning, the air warm. The bed was empty. He stopped, not startled, not afraid, just standing still. She was crouching near the corner, huddled in the same shirt he had given her, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes wide and black. She didn't run. She could have run. She didn't. She didn't look at him. Her hand clenched the glass of water, drinking in short, trembling sips. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, but her eyes were alert now, aware, observing everything, watching him like a hunted animal. He took a slow step toward the table, sat down, opened a piece of dried meat from his coat pocket, and placed it on the edge of the table for her to see, then turned back to mend the torn reins he had intended to repair. She didn't say anything, but when he looked up again, the bread was gone. He didn't smile, but something in his chest, something that had been tight for years, shifted. She was staying, at least for now, and that was enough. The days that followed passed without a word being spoken. But each hour carried its own weight. She stayed close to the wall, never turning her back on him. She didn't sleep much, not when he was around. He heard her moving in the night, light footsteps moving in the darkness as the fire died down. Twice he woke up to find her squatting by the door, clutching the blanket to her chest as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. She never asked where she was or who he was, but she didn't try to leave. That was something. Silas did not rush her. He kept to a routine, feeding the horses, saddling them, hauling in the wood. He moved steadily, predictably, careful not to startle her. Every action, every movement, he made slower than usual, not out of weakness, just on purpose. He wasn't used to having company, not anymore. And the last thing he wanted was to make her feel cornered. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask. He thought if she wanted to tell him, she would. But one afternoon, 3 days after he had brought her home, while he was slicing jerky at the table, and she was squatting near the fireplace with his needle and some spare cloth, she said softly, as if testing whether it was safe to let it exist out loud, "Saya." He looked up. She didn't repeat, didn't look at him, just kept sewing. Her hands were shaking, but focused. She was trying to make something out of his old linen, a shirt, probably a loose-cut shirt to fit her. His shirt still hung loosely over her shoulder, slipping too low when she moved. She didn't try to adjust it when he was near anymore. But her discomfort was still evident, not shame, but simply the need to feel ownership of what covered her. "Saya," he replied, his voice low. There was a pause. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It was the first thread of something real between them. That evening, she went one step further. He came in after chopping wood and found the table cleaned and the fireplace swept. The pot of beans he left out had been stirred and heated over the fire. She sat on the floor beside him, her legs drawn up under her shirt and blanket, still keeping her distance, but clearly no longer afraid to move in that space. He said nothing, just nodded, took a tin bowl, and scooped food for both of them. They ate in silence, not awkward, just quiet. She had washed her face earlier that day. Her skin, though still pink from fever, was no longer covered with soot. The bruises on her arms were healing. Her lips were no longer chapped. She had even trimmed some of the tangles from her hair. Though the burnt beads were still stuck to it, she wasn't better, not yet, but she wasn't waiting to die anymore. Silas noticed something else that night. Her eyes kept looking at the shelf beside his bed. On it were two objects, an old cigarette case and a cloth-wrapped package. She didn't touch them, but he saw the curiosity. He didn't explain what they were, but the fact that she noticed them meant she was paying attention, understanding where she was. She wasn't just surviving, she was watching. Then, as she curled up by the fire and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, he sat at the table and tried to read a few pages of a tattered book. He kept an army handbook on Western reconnaissance techniques, mostly useless now. But his eyes weren't focused on the words. He kept thinking about how she had almost died out there. And why? There were still questions, of course. Why had her tribe rejected her? What exactly had she refused? Was she married? Was she fleeing something worse than exile? But he did not ask. He had seen too many men demand answers from those too hurt to give them. She wasn't ready. And honestly, so does he. What he did was leave her alone for half a day the next morning. He signaled to her that he was going to check the south fence. He wasn't sure if she understood, but when he turned back, she was still there. The fire was still burning. The cabin had been swept, and on the table was the linen dress she had made, neatly folded. It was poorly sewn, uneven in places, but it was hers. She had made it with his scraps, his thread, and her time. That evening, she wore it. She had also bathed, her hair damp, in a simple braid. She stepped out of the sink with wet shoulders and fresh skin. Her body, though still covered in fading bruises, no longer looked abandoned. The cloth shirt fell loosely over the chest and down past the hips. It didn't completely hide her curves, but it was hers now. Not a shirt out of pity, not a piece of skin forced on her as punishment. It was her doing. And she walked with a little more back straight. That night, when she handed him the tin coffee cup, her fingers touched his. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. It was the smallest thing, but it stayed with him. She had said her name, cleared his table, sewed her own clothes, stayed when she could have run away, touched his hand. Silas knew better than to rush things. He was not looking for gratitude. He was not looking for a woman. Not after what he had lost. But he was not blind either. Something was forming in the silence. Not forgiveness, not love, not yet, but something worth protecting. And for a man like him, that was enough to keep him going. The weather grew colder even though spring was approaching. Dry winds swept across the hills and frost gathered at the edges of the troughs before dawn. The wooden house creaked at night as the boards shrank in the cold, but the fire still burned inside. And for the first time in years, Silas wasn't the only one tending it. Saya had started to wake up early. Not before him. He was always the first, but not long after, she moved silently through the wooden house, barefoot on the floor, her homemade linen shirt hanging off one shoulder, her long black hair braided and tied with a piece of string she had found. Her presence changed the rhythm of the place. More than just the work was done, but it was the way she moved through space, the way she wiped the oil lamp without asking, the way she folded the blanket neatly like never before. There is order again, not just survival. One morning, Silas came in from the stables with a pail of milk and stopped. She was sweeping the floor with a pine broom, her new dress, still made from his old shirts and spare canvas, hugged her waist and breasts in a way that made his jaw tighten. She recognized him, stopped. For the first time, she held his gaze. Not long, just a breath, but it held. Then she turned back to what she was doing as if to say, I see you and I are still here. He put the bucket down without saying a word. That same day, while cleaning out the shed, Silas noticed something he had not noticed for days. She had reattached the beads to her hair. They were small, blackened by fire, and partly cracked, but she had attached them to the end of one braid, 3 in all. He didn't comment, but that told him something she hadn't said. She wasn't trying to forget her origins. She just doesn't let it define her anymore. That afternoon, she went out with a bucket and followed him to the stables without asking. She watched him fix a loose board on the barn door, kneeling in the dirt, hammer in hand. After a moment, without a word, she stepped forward and held the board steady so he would drive the nails straight. Her fingers were calloused. Her hands did not shake. He did not thank her, not because he was ungrateful, but because she seemed to like it. Instead, when they were done, he handed her his knife and pointed to the pile of hides in the shed. He had seen her glance at it before. Apache women knew how to handle and work with leather better than most settlers. She took the blade, knelt down, and began to shape the leather into long, thin ropes. He did not correct her. She didn't ask for help. Hours passed like that. Quiet, helpful, sharing. By evening, the sun sets into a golden mist and dust over the fields. Inside, she stirred the beans while he chopped wood to start the fire. When he sat down to eat, he poured her coffee without asking. She took it without hesitation. A small thing happened then. She leaned forward across the table to take the salt box. Her neckline was slightly lower, revealing the slope of her breasts. He caught a glimpse out of the corner of his eye. Motionless for half a second, she noticed. Her hand paused on the salt box. Then she glanced at him. He didn't look away this time, but he didn't stare. He just looked straight into her eyes and held them there, letting her decide if it mattered. After a while, she put down the salt box and continued eating. The next morning, she was the one who poured the coffee first. That evening, she sat next to him on the porch chair. It was the first time she had chosen to sit so close. The wind had picked up, and she had one of his coats draped over her shoulders. The sleeves rolled up to her elbow. She didn't speak, nor did he, but her leg rubbed against his. She didn't move. Neither did he. He felt the warmth of her thighs through the fabric. She folded her arms over her lap and leaned back, letting the wind blow through her loose braids. After a moment, she stirred, resting her head on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, just stood still, eyes looking up at the darkening sky, his heart beating a little faster than usual. And then, softly, she spoke the first complete sentence he had ever heard from her. "Why did you help me?" Not an accusatory question, just a fact. He thought long and hard before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, because no one else did. That was all he said. And she nodded as if that was enough. It was the only answer he had. He didn't need to tell her about his wife buried behind the cabin, about how she fell ill that first winter and never recovered, about how the silence of this place has grown louder every year since then, about how he stopped riding into town because there was no one worth talking to. about how he once believed that the only things left to him were fence posts, cattle, and the sound of the wind under the eaves. Now she was here and everything had changed. She sat beside him until the last ray of sunlight disappeared. As they stood, he stepped aside to let her enter the cabin first. As she passed, her hand brushed his this time. Slowly, he didn't reach out, but he felt it long after she was gone. That night, she slept in the bed again. He slept on the floor, but they both knew without saying that they were no longer strangers in that room. Not anymore. And by morning, something unspoken between them had settled like the ash that had marked her skin. Quiet, steady, and no longer a symbol of shame. The days blended together with a peaceful rhythm, as if the land had finally stopped holding its breath. March brought thawing soil and longer light, though the nights were still bitterly cold. The silence between Silas and Saya was no longer heavy. It is the silence of habit, of two people sharing the same space, the same job without having to explain themselves to each other. Yet there are still things left unsaid, questions no one asks out loud. That morning, Silas sat sharpening his old skinning knife on the edge of the porch, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare. Saya was in the garden behind the cabin, digging the soil with a short-handled hoe. Her dress, now fitted and carefully mended, clung to her back with sweat. He glanced over and caught her adjusting the shoulder straps, revealing the smooth slope of her collarbone. She felt him looking at her and stopped, then went back to work. They didn't speak, but the atmosphere between them had changed. What was once avoidance has turned into awareness. The inside of the cabin is different now, too. She had arranged the shelves, placed his folded shirts in a pine box, and spread a fresh tablecloth on the table. There was a bundle of dried herbs on the fireplace she had made from what she had found. The room now smelled of sage, not just smoke. After lunch, she surprised him. He was mending a torn bridle when she entered the stable and knelt beside him. Holding a small package wrapped in leather, she said nothing, just set it down beside him. He opened it slowly, tiredly, confused, and inside was a small carved statue, simple, made of bone. A woman kneeling, Apache style. His chest tightened. "I did it," she said. He looked at her. Her voice was soft, but sure. "For your wife," she added. The grave. He had not told her about the grave, not directly, but she had seen the wooden cross behind the cage. The way he avoided looking at it every time he passed, she must have pieced it all together. Her people knew how to read the signs. He swallowed, eyes on the carving. It is not beautiful, but it is carefully made. The statue's head is bowed slightly, its hands placed before its chest. Sorrow, perhaps respect. Silas said nothing. He couldn't, but after a moment he nodded, stood up, and walked toward the tomb. She followed. He knelt at the edge of the mound, brushed the pine needles off the base of the cross, and placed the statue there near its feet. Then stepped back. She stood beside him, her hands clasped before her chest. Finally, he said, "Her name is Clara." Saya didn't ask further, just let it sink in. That evening, they sat at the table, eating quietly as usual, but something was off. She seemed relieved, even smiling once when he accidentally spilled salt and muttered under his breath. When he looked up, surprised by her reaction, she didn't cover her face as before. Her eyes held his. "You curse like a soldier," she said dryly. "I was one," he replied. And just like that, another truth emerged between them. He had never said it out loud before, not to her, not to anyone since the war. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, scouting for the Union Army, hunting for tracks through Apache land. He had his reasons, like everyone else, but reasons couldn't wash blood from memory. She didn't look angry, just nodded. "I guess," she said. Then added, "You went like a soldier." That night, after the fire had died down and he lay down on the floor as usual, she hesitated. He watched from where he lay, expecting her to blow out the light and crawl into bed. Instead, she stood over him for a long moment. The hem of her dress brushed his arm. Then, gently, she leaned down. Her fingers touched his scar. The scar on his ribs, just below the edge of his shirt. She brushed it lightly. almost without pressure, just contact. It wasn't a question, it wasn't pity, it was understanding. I know what that feels like, she whispered. Her eyes glanced up at him. When marked, he didn't answer. There was no need. He just slowly reached up and touched her wrist. She didn't flinch, and for the first time since he found her half dead and covered in ash, she leaned down and gently rested her forehead against his. Not a kiss, not yet, just closeness. Something was held. Then she rose quietly, moved to the bed, and lay down. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the rafters. Her figure outlined in the firelight. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders rose and fell. He had no intention of paying that much attention. But she was here, still breathing, still here. And so was he. That night had changed something. Neither of them said it, but both of them felt it. The air between them no longer had any distance. That doesn't mean they touch each other freely or talk openly. But there is a shift, a silent understanding. In the days that followed, Saya no longer avoided touching him. She moved around the cabin as if she belonged there, not as a guest, not as someone waiting to leave, but as someone claiming space. She tended the fire before he woke, washed his clothes without asking, and he let her do it. One morning, while Silas was fixing a broken gate hinge, he found her outside with a bucket, kneeling by the weak stream behind the barns. Her sleeves were rolled up and the fabric clung to her hips as she worked. She was washing the vegetables she had dug up from the edge of the bush. Water glistened on her arms. Her skin smooth now where the bruises had faded. She didn't glance at him. She doesn't need him. That afternoon, she placed a bowl of stew before him, then sat across the table, leaning on her elbows and sipping from her cup. Her posture relaxed. Her eyes met his and did not look away. Your people, he said softly, pausing in mid-bite. They might come looking for you. She was silent for a moment. Then, no, he didn't press her. But she continued, her voice steady. They chose. I chose. He nodded slowly. The clarity in her tone told him more than words. Whatever happened, whatever custom or rule was broken, was not something she regretted. She had lived with those people all her life, and now she was rebuilding that life from the pieces. She didn't ask what he meant by her people. She understood he meant her tribe, her past, what she had left or been torn from, and she made it clear without anger that it was behind her. That evening, they sat next to each other on the porch again. It had become a routine after dinner. He sipped his coffee. She braided her hair while watching the sky turn to dust. But this time, she did something different. She turned to him and held out the end of her braid. He looked at it, then at her. She nodded slightly. He took it in his hand, his fingers rough and calloused, and tied the end tightly with the same piece of cloth she always used. Not perfect, a little loose, she smiled. Then, before he could put it down, she leaned forward and kissed him. It doesn't take long. It wasn't desperate, just slow and warm. Her lips were soft against his. Her breath caught in her nostrils. Her hand rested on his chest, fingers curling slightly over the fabric of his shirt. He didn't pull away. As she did, she lingered close. You never asked what they did to me, she whispered. Silas swallowed. I thought you would tell me if you wanted to. I don't want to, she said softly, but I want you to know this. What they took away was not mine to give. He understood. Language did not need to be precise. Such pain leaves its own truth, and her voice conveyed it without detail. I didn't save you for that, he said. I know. The wind stirred between them. Her braid brushed his shoulder. I chose to stay. She added, you didn't ask me to. I won't. That night, she did not go to bed. She knelt before the hearth as the fire died down, then rose and crossed the cabin in silence. He looked up from his chair, unlacing his boots. She reached out. He stood. She led him to bed. They didn't talk. There was no ceremony, no plan, just the slow unbuttoning of his shirt, the way her fingers traced lines over his chest, the way he paused at the curve of her waist, waiting. Her warm breath touched his collarbone. Her body, strong, full, and real, melted into his without shame. He touched her gently, always looking into her eyes. She did not flinch. The firelight flickered on the wall as they lay. She let his hand up to her ribs where the ashes had once clung. He kissed her there slowly, gently. Their movements were unhurried, careful, intimate, genuine. When her breath caught and her fingers tightened on his shoulders, he stood still, waiting for her to lead. She did, and when it was over, he didn't leave. They lay holding each other under the covers. Her head rested under his chin, her hand resting on the scar on his side. He closed his eyes and felt her heartbeat against his chest. It was the first night in years he didn't wake up alone, and neither did she. In the silence, there was no need for vow. There were no declarations, but the way she held him said it all. I stayed, and I'm not afraid anymore. The next morning, when they lay together for the first time, the cabin was warmer even though the fire had died down. Silas stirred first, careful not to wake her. Saya's body curled against his, her hands resting on his chest. One leg was draped over his thigh under the covers. Her hair was spread across the pillow they shared, and her breathing was steady, deep, without a trace of worry. He hadn't seen anyone sleep like that in his bed in 7 years. He stared at the rafters for a long time, unmoving. Part of him still hoped it would go away, that she would vanish like a fever dream, that he would find himself alone again. But when she stirred and muttered softly in her sleep, her hands squeezed his chest for a moment. He knew this was no dream. When she finally opened her eyes, she did not flinch. She didn't pull the blanket up to cover her body. She just looked at him. They lay like that for a few minutes. No words, no hurry. Finally, she sat up. The blanket pulled low over her hips. He saw her silhouette clearly in the gray morning light. Her back was straight, her shoulders no longer hunched, her skin bare, but not ashamed. The ashes, the bruises, the marks were gone now, or rather, they no longer defined her. She turned slightly and said, "Do you regret it?" He didn't have to think. Or not. She nodded once as if confirming something she already believed. That morning, they moved together in the cabin as if they had been doing so for years. She cooked while he pulled the food. He poured her coffee. She made the blanket without being asked, but the space between them now held a silent intimacy. An invisible thread stretched between their gestures, even in silence. Then, while Silas was chopping wood, she came up with 2 small packages in her hand. He put down the axe and stood up straight. "I found these in the storage chest," she said. A package containing faded blue fabric from an old army jacket that he hadn't worn since before Clara died. The other package was a strip of canvas and a spool of thread. "I think I'll make something for you," she said, looking straight at him. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve and nodded. "Okay." She paused. "It won't be pretty." "It doesn't have to be pretty." She smiled faintly and turned back inside. That evening, she gave him the result. A new shirt. It was simple and stiff, and the sleeves were uneven. But when he put it on, it fit. She watched him adjust his collar, and her fingers reached up to help smooth the creases in his neck. "You look like yourself," she said softly. He wasn't sure what she meant. Perhaps he no longer looked like a haunted man. Maybe to her, he looked complete. That night, while she was cleaning near the fireplace, he brought out something he hadn't touched in years. A small cedar box that had been kept on the top shelf. He put it on the table. She stopped scanning. He opened it slowly and took out a simple brass ring. "This is Clara's," he said, "but she's gone and she wants me to give it to someone who can wear it." He didn't give it to her. He just put it on the table. "If you want it," he added. Saya stepped forward, her eyes on the ring. She did not pick it up immediately. "I am not her," she said. "I know. I won't be what you had before." He looked at her. "I don't want what I had before. I want what I have now." She stared at him for a long moment, then bent down, took the ring, and slipped it on her own finger. It was loose, but she didn't mind. She looked up, her jaw set. "Then I'll stay." He nodded once. "You stayed." They didn't call it a marriage. No priest blessed it. None of the neighbors knew. But the next morning, they made a second chair together. She helped him measure the wood, laughing when he miscounted the lines. And he let her tease him. He nailed the pieces together while she sanded the edges. 2 chairs now sat by the fireplace, 2 cups on the shelf, 2 folded blankets at the foot of the bed. When the wind blew hard again outside, she didn't reach for the door as if she might run away. She reached for his hand. And for the first time in both of their lives, neither of them felt alone. Spring slowly turned to early summer. The grass thickened around the fence, and the stream behind the stable began to flow steadily again. The days are long, warm, and full of work, but the kind of work that brings meaning, not burden. Silas and Saya had settled into something neither of them had dared to hope for at the beginning of that long winter. A peace lingered. The sapling behind the cabin had taken root. Every morning, Saya checked its leaves, brushed away the dry soil around its base, and watered it with the same care she gave to the house and their lives in it. It grew slowly, but it grew. That was enough. One morning, she stepped out onto the porch with a quiet smile on her lips. The air was still cool. The sun had not yet risen above the mountains. She wore the same dress she had made herself a few months ago, soft now from washing and wear. But today her hair was braided with new pieces of blue thread. Silas was chopping wood near the barn. When he saw her, he stopped. "You're up early," he said. She walked toward him, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I made something." He wiped his hands and gently took it from her. Inside was a small shirt, sewn with tighter stitches this time, clearly made with effort and time. It was too small for both of them. He looked at her slowly. She said nothing, just looked at his face, then softly, "Not sure yet, but I think so." He held the shirt for a long time. His voice was very soft when he spoke. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes shining, not with fear, but with something more solid. "I missed a moon. I feel different. My body, it's telling me something." He stepped forward and placed one hand on her waist, the other against her stomach. She covered it with both hands. There was a long silence. Then he leaned down and kissed her softly. Slowly, his lips against her forehead, then her mouth. "Then we will raise them here," he said together. It was not a promise he made lightly, and she knew it. That was why she leaned against his chest and let herself breathe deeply, finally no longer burdened in her lungs. That weekend, they went into town together. It had been almost a year since Silas had been seen with anyone. The people of Briar Hollow looked at them as they stepped from the chariot. Saya's skin, her dress, her Apache features, all drew glances, but Silas walked beside her without hesitation. His hand brushed hers as they entered the department store. She held her chin high. He bought cloth, flour, tulle. She picked out blue ribbon, thread, and a pair of soft walking shoes. No one said much, but the message was clear. He had accepted her, and she had chosen to stay. On the way back, she leaned against him in the trunk, eyes closed, wind blowing through her braids. "You don't regret it?" she asked softly. "All the things anyone would think." He didn't answer immediately. Then, "I regret not meeting you sooner." When they returned home, she unpacked while he repaired the carriage wheel. That evening, they had a quiet dinner on the porch. The sky turned orange and pink over the distant mountains. Cattle moved slowly across the fields. The land seemed to come alive. She took out the bronze ring again, still a little loose on her finger. But this time, she took it off, handed it to him, and held out her hand. "You never asked," she said. He took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger again, slowly and deliberately. "I don't need a priest," she whispered. "Just me." He looked at her, his voice steady. "Then you have me." And that was their wedding. No church, no audience. Just a man and a woman standing barefoot on their own land, with dirt under their fingernails and peace in their bones. The next morning, she stood in the doorway with her hand on her stomach. He stepped behind her, slipped his arms around her waist, and placed his hands beside hers. Behind them, 2 chairs were placed by the fireplace. Outside, the sapling has grown 2 new leaves, a home, a family. A life is built not from saving, but from staying. Everything that was once torn away from them is now theirs to rebuild together. And this time, no one can take it away.